This presentation covers defining behaviors and writing behavioral objectives. Before you watch this video, read Chapter 2 of the textbook very carefully. I would suggest printing out a handout of the PowerPoint and then taking some additional notes as you watch the presentations. You may want to also include page numbers, having the book open and record page numbers that you can refer back to later. This will save you a lot of time when you're studying later on. At this point in the course, it's sometimes difficult for folks to understand why it's important to spend the time we do on defining behaviors very carefully. I believe it'll become more apparent as we move on in the course why this is so important. As you learned from the information on the behavioral model, we focus on observable behavior. In other words, what is it that we actually see? Those are the things that we measure, and those are the things by which we judge whether or not an intervention is helping a student or not. So we stay away from subjective terms like Billy's hyperactive or Johnny's non-compliant, because while they're descriptive, they don't really tell us exactly what we're looking at. So often when we're looking at a behavioral problem, the first step is to clearly define the behaviors. That way we make sure that everyone's on the same page, and again, it gives us something very specific to measure so that we know if our intervention is working or not. I had a meeting with one of my students yesterday. She's a teacher, and she is involved with the RTI and behavioral intervention team at her school. One of the things she said was, I'm getting more and more teachers coming to me with kids with attending problems. So we talked a little bit about that, and we decided maybe the first step is taking attending and translating it into observable behaviors. When she did that, she found that the teachers were actually talking about a number of different things. Some teachers were talking about kids who were not following directions. Some teachers were referring to kids who had very poor self-management skills, and other people were referring to kids that were just sort of staring out of a window and spacing out when they were supposed to be attending. Each of those different issues would require a different kind of intervention. So that's why it's important from the very beginning that we really look at clear definitions. The other thing we're going to cover is writing behavioral objectives. I know you're most likely getting this in another class, and you also have been exposed to it in the past, but it's very important to really put some thought into how we write objectives and why. And I think those reasons will become apparent later on also. In terms of objectives, the question that we often get is why? Well, first of all, it helps us as teachers focus on very specific behaviors that we want to change. So a good definition of a behavior and a good objective go hand in hand. Whether we're teaching the student a new skill or we have a problem behavior that we want to decrease, we need a clear definition, and an objective gives us a focus, and it also gives us a direction that we want to go in. It's useful for monitoring progress. It helps us compare where the student was before the intervention to how she or he is doing after we implement an intervention. It helps us teach more effectively. If we're able to monitor the effectiveness of our instruction or our behavioral interventions and quickly make changes, we become better teachers and we become better professionals in changing the behavior of our students. We're able to respond and adapt more quickly. They're also useful in communicating expectations to other people. When I read an objective that's very clearly written and I see that a student has accomplished that, I have a very good sense of what that student can do and what that student can't do. So an objective is a way to communicate a lot of information very quickly. It's also a legal requirement. It's part of the law. It's part of IDEA, and it's a requirement. Teachers who can write very good objectives learn to do so more efficiently. They don't spend a lot of time doing it because they're able to do it effectively and efficiently. There's some specific things that we need to understand when we're writing objectives and we're defining behavior. And I'm talking about these interchangeably a little because they do work together. Behavioral definition refers to how do I describe a behavior in such a way and define it in such a way that if you and I were observing a student on different sides of the room and we were counting the number of times a behavior occurred or counting how long it occurred, we would agree very closely. So it's more difficult than it seems to get good agreement on behavior. You have to start with a good definition. The first requirement of a good definition is it has to be objective. Objective means that you can see it, you can feel it, you can hear it, you can experience it with your senses. It's something that a person does. This is different from some kind of inferred internal state. For instance, if you were observing a student and I was on the phone and I said, "What's the student doing right now?" And you said, "Well, he's acting really angry." Well, you're describing behavior and you're interpreting some intent there, but when I'm on the other end of the phone, I have really no idea of what that person's doing. The person could be sitting cross-armed in a chair, skulking at somebody, or the person could be stomping around or pushing over tables. There are a number of things. So translate that into what the person actually does. The format that we'll use that makes that easier is we'll use action, object person, and then qualifier sometimes. The focus is on action object. In other words, the action is what's being done. The object or person is the receiver of the action. So if you see a kid that's stamping his feet, stamp feet fits that action object requirement because stamping is the action, the object is the floor or the feet. If a person hits another person, then hits peers would be the action object formulation. Sometimes it's important to add a qualifier to indicate the intensity of a behavior. For instance, pinches peers such that it leaves a mark. So that's a description of how hard the person's pinching. Something that I always talk about at this point in the course is something called the potato test. It actually, when I learned it, it was called the dead man test, but I thought that sounded kind of negative, so I call it the potato test. And here's the potato test. If the behavior that you're defining is something a potato can do, it's probably not a good definition of a behavior. So the potato test is really a way of determining if something is a behavior or a non-behavior. For instance, does not complete work. Well, if you put a potato down and you put a worksheet and a pencil in front of it, and you say, "Get to work," not much is going to happen. So does not complete work is what we call a non-behavior, just like does not follow directions, does not give eye contact. Potato has eyes, but it doesn't really give you eye contact, I guess, well, unless you hold a potato up to your eye. So it's a way of determining if something is a non-behavior. Always talk about what someone is doing and not what someone is not doing. And the reason is that it's hard to measure what someone didn't do. You can count the number of times that someone followed a direction, but it's harder to count the number of times that someone didn't follow a direction. You'd have to look at, well, what are the possible opportunities, and among those, when did the person follow a direction? So if you're recording following directions, and that's a very, very low number, that's the information you need. Good definitions of behaviors or good behaviors have a clear beginning and a clear end. In other words, you can measure when it starts, you can measure when it stops. They're also repeatable. In other words, if I define a behavior adequately, that definition will apply to multiple occurrences. An example would be if I was so narrow in my definition to say that when a peer says, "You look funny," Sally says, "I do not," and then runs and slaps the person. Okay, that may be what happened one time, but let's suppose that a peer walks up and says, "Hey, who cut your hair?" and then Sally goes up and hits him. That would not meet the first definition because the peer didn't say, "You look funny." So you want to define a behavior so that it's going to capture repeated incidents of a behavior. So don't define it too narrowly. The goal there is that so two or more people who are looking at the behavior, who are observing, are going to see the same thing. And they're going to count it as having happened the same number of times or for the same length of time. A term that we use to describe this is called pinpointing. Pinpointing is when I really have a definition that zooms in on what the behavior looks like so that two people are agreeing. Good definition is also operational. Operational refers to how the behavior is measured. So an operational definition means I'm defining something in the terms in which it's measured. For example, what we'll talk about in a few minutes is some behaviors are more important or more adequately measured by how long they last. For example, if I have a student who's having a tantrum could last 5 minutes, it could last 30 minutes. So we need to define what a tantrum is, first of all. Well, we need to use action-object terms. Tantrums really are when two or more behaviors are happening at the same time, like falls to the floor and bangs hands and feet on the floor while screaming. That would be a sort of a tantrum. If I did it, people would probably come and lock me up, but kids can get away with it sometimes. So if we have an operational definition, it would be when two or more of these behaviors begin, we'll start measuring the tantrum, and when they stop, we'll stop measuring the tantrum. So we'd be looking at measuring the duration there. Slicing is another way of looking at behaviors. When you break things down, sometimes if we have really big chunks of behavior, like you're counting the number of books someone reads. I don't know if you folks did this, but when I was in elementary school, we'd have a summer competition. How many books did you read during the summer? I worked on a farm, so I didn't read very many books in the summer. I sort of worked from sun up until 9 o'clock at night, and I didn't feel like reading many books, so I never won that one. But some of my peers would read. I read 30 books. Of course, it depends on how long the books are, I suppose. If you wanted to really measure the amount of reading a child was doing, the number of books might be too big of a measure. It might take someone a couple of weeks to read one book. So slicing means you're taking that bigger unit of behavior and you're breaking it down into smaller pieces that are going to give you a more sensitive measure. So, it could be the number of pages that someone turned, or the number of words that someone said correctly, or the number of sounds someone said. Another example is interacts with peers. We'll be talking a lot about social skills, especially with kids with autism. You really have to define social skills very carefully. They're a little more difficult to measure than something like turning the page of a book, but with a little practice you can measure them pretty accurately. So for interacts with peers, we might do starts interactions or responds to a peer's initiation. Those are two different behaviors. We'd measure those separately. We might be interested in both. So starts an interaction might be defined as the student approaches a peer and either asks a question or invites the peer to play or something like that. Response to a peer initiations might be that when a peer makes a request or gives an invitation, the student that we're observing responds by either appropriately accepting or declining the invitation. It's like, "No thanks, I'm busy right now, but thanks for asking me." That would be an appropriate response. That would be responding to a peer initiation. You could measure the number of times those happen. That's a lot more sensitive than just saying we're going to look at interacting with peers. We've broken the behavior down into smaller units that are going to give us more specific information. Another way of measuring behavior is to look at a task analysis. A task analysis is when you take a skill that involves a sequence of steps, like brushing teeth, and you break it down into individual steps. Then you can measure whether or not the student performs each step. This is an example of behavioral definitions. Well, these are not complete definitions, but it shows you some of the words that you might use in a definition. The first column gives examples of global statements. These are the ways that people usually talk. The next column is action. These are action words that describe specific behaviors. So we don't want to use global terms, but we want to use action object terms. In other words, instead of saying someone interacts nicely, we say something very specific like shares toys. And then sometimes we add a qualifier. Shares toys with peers, or self-motivated mean finishes tasks independently. Neat and tidy, we're more specifically saying picks up materials by himself or independently. Those are more easily measured. So if I said, I want you to write a definition for picking up materials, then you could say, we'll count that as each time Billy picks up an object and puts it into the appropriate place in his bedroom. And then you could just watch him and count the number of times he does that. By himself simply means he did it without a prompt or reminder from someone else. So at this point it would be good just to stop the recording, think of some global terms that you hear. I actually did hear someone say hyper-aggressive once. It's not an actual diagnosis, it's something just someone made up. And the kid actually hit and kicked peers. That was the problem behavior. Think of some global terms that you've heard, and then write down action object qualifier words to go along with them. And then when we meet back in class, I'll ask you to share some of those. When recording a behavior, it's important to focus on what someone actually does, not the absence of the behavior. Remember the potato test. If it's something that someone's actually doing, we can measure it more accurately. So we wouldn't say the person does not follow directions. We record the behavior of following directions, and if that happens at a very low rate compared to other students, that's a problem. There are three kinds of behaviors that we're going to be measuring in this class. The first one is we'll be defining and measuring some kind of challenging behavior, like hits peers, destroys property. This is something that someone actually does. Another behavior is a desired behavior or a goal behavior. Completes assignments, follows directions. So this is an appropriate behavior, a good behavior that we want to increase or we want to teach the person. These goal behaviors can be either a replacement behavior. In other words, if any kind of problem behavior is occurring, we want to identify an appropriate behavior that might serve the same purpose as the problem behavior. We'll cover that later in the course in more detail, but at this point we'll just suffice it to say that all behaviors happen for a reason. Our job as behavior analysts and as teachers is to understand why the behavior is occurring and give the student some better tools for meeting his or her needs. In other words, if a kid engages in a challenging behavior, the purpose of that behavior is to get the attention of the teacher. We need to teach that student another way to get the teacher's attention. So sometimes we'll be talking about replacement behaviors, sometimes we'll be talking about alternative behaviors. Sometimes we'll be talking about behaviors that are really intermediate steps between what the person does now and the goal behavior. For example, the goal behavior might be for the student to complete work without interruptions. At this point, though, the student will become disruptive or do other things to avoid or escape work. An intermediate behavior we might teach the student to do is to request a short break. And then we can limit the number of breaks and then have the expectation that the student completes some work and then take a break. That would be an intermediate step to finishing work without taking a break. And it might take us a while to get there. So, what behaviors do we define? We're looking at the learner's behavior. So the learner's behavior is either going to be a challenging behavior or an alternative or replacement behavior. And then we're going to be looking at things called antecedents and consequences. Antecedents are things that occur just before a behavior that might cue or signal the behavior. Consequences are things that immediately follow the behavior. These are things that can serve as reinforcers or as punishers. So they're the events that might strengthen a behavior. When we talk about antecedents and consequences, we're usually talking about the behavior of other people. So antecedents are usually things that a teacher does that antecedents and consequences are usually the behavior of someone else. As I said, either the teacher or other children, peers. Behavioral objectives have a number of purposes that we discussed earlier, and the format that we want you to use has 4 parts. The who's going to perform the behavior, what's the specific behavior the person's going to do, under what conditions is the person going to perform the behavior, and to what criterion is the person going to be able to perform the behavior. We'll talk about each of these separately. One of the things that we need to distinguish is the difference between goals and objectives. A long-range goal refers to an entire area of instruction. For example, we might refer to recreation and leisure as a domain area, or vocational skills as an area. So a long-range goal might be for the person to become independent in recreation and leisure, or be able to access things in the community. A long-range objective is what we want the person to be able to achieve or do after we've conducted some instruction in that area. And a short-term objective is just a smaller chunk of behavior. There may be, for instance, several short-term objectives under a long-term objective. So a long-term objective might be for a person to hold a job independently. There may be several short-term objectives related to specific skills related to that more long-term goal. When you choose behaviors or objectives, there are several things to consider. One of them is the fair pair rule. This is the idea that anytime we decrease a behavior, we want to identify an appropriate behavior to increase. So if we want to decrease physical aggression, we want to look at the purpose or the function of that aggression. What's the person trying to get out of it? We may find that it's a way that student escapes demands. Then we want to identify a skill that will help that person either cope with the demands or somehow request a break, or in other words, what's a behavior that person's going to use to get the same need met that the problem behavior met. Functional skills are specific skills that are going to enable the person to be more independent and to rely less on other people to do things for him or her. When I was in school, I was taught the way to define a functional skill is if you don't learn how to do the skill yourself, you're going to have to pay someone to do it for you. And that's always been a good definition. Skills that you need to use all the time impact your independence more than skills that you only do once in a while. For example, I pay someone to help me do my income tax. That doesn't impact my independence that much because it's something I only do once a year. If I was not able to brush my teeth anymore, I would have to pay someone to help me do that every single day, and that would impact my independence. Another thing to look at is the criterion of the next environment. So wherever the student is, what are going to be the expectations at the next level? Recently I've been working with a third grade boy who has some challenging behavior. He's about to go into the fourth grade, so we spent some time talking with the fourth grade teacher about what her expectations were, and those determined the objectives we worked on this year. Another concept is social validity. Social validity has to do with to what degree does society value this behavior. So, in other words, if a person is going to be regarded as someone that's independent in our society, there's certain things we expect the person to be able to do. We expect the person to be able to ask for help if needed. That's considered very important. In school, there are certain behaviors that are more important than in a workplace. For example, if a student can follow directions, that's socially valid, or that's viewed as an important skill for someone to have. And then finally, age appropriateness has to do with the extent to which these behaviors are something that is done by same age peers. These slides simply go through each of those concepts, talk about them. So these give you some good examples, and I will just let you go through these at your own pace. Later on in your program, when you take the Instructional Methods course for students with developmental disabilities, you're going to learn about an approach called ecological inventory. That approach is represented on this slide. It has to do with first defining a major domain, such as vocational skills. Within that domain, you determine what the major environments are. For example, it may be place of work, if the person's working, let's say, at a store, then the store is the major environment. The sub-environments are the different areas within that major environment. For example, if a person's working in a grocery store, the sub-environments would be the produce section, the area in the back where foods are packaged and weighed, the meat section, the canned food sections. Those are all sub-environments. The activities are the specific skills that one needs to learn in each of those sub-environments. So this is the way that you actually determine what things you need to teach a person. So for each of those skills, you may transfer those into objectives. So learning to package and use a shrink wrap machine may be the skill that you would teach the person. We're not going to get into this a great deal in this course because it's something that you're going to cover in much more detail later on in your program. But it's important at this point just to be aware of it. It's a way of focusing on what skills someone needs. We mentioned task analysis before. That's when we take a skill that involves a sequence of steps like tying shoes, brushing teeth, and we break it down into individual steps. The goal here is to teach the person to do the steps in a sequence. It's important for purposes of data collection to be able to break the skill down into observable behaviors, and then we can measure whether the student is completing each behavior independently. When we choose the criteria of the next environment, we measure the level of skill that someone needs to perform in the next environment. Major transition points for kids in school are going from primary grades to middle school, going from middle school to high school, and then going from high school to vocational placement or whatever environment the student's going to after school. It's important to always plan ahead. So when we start talking about transition skills, we take a look at what the student's going to need to be successful in the next environment. And we're going to focus on teaching those skills. So the main points that we want to look at are what's the minimum level of skill that someone needs to just move on to the next level? What is the minimum level of skill someone needs to perform or be successful, typically in those conditions? And then what does a person need to do to maintain those skills over time? Once we've decided on the skills that we need to teach, whatever model we've used, whether we've used an ecological approach or some other model, it's time to write an objective. An objective has 4 primary components. The first component of an objective is the condition. The condition specifies the context in which the behavior is going to be performed, if some materials are needed, or if the student needs any kind of assistive device to perform the skill, we include that. If the student's going to require some kind of cues or prompts, we include that in the objective as well. Or we may involve like motivating conditions if the student needs some kind of reinforcement to be able to perform the behavior. An example that might make this a little clearer, last year I did a study with some high school boys who were very prompt dependent. In other words, they relied on cues from the teacher to do a lot of different skills. I taught them to use video iPods to prepare food independently. So we made little video clips that we did a task analysis of different skills like making a smoothie or making mac and cheese in a microwave. And we did a task analysis, and then we did a little video clip of each step. The teacher performed each of those steps, and I recorded her. And then we set up an iPod so that the steps were little thumbnail pictures. When the student touched the thumbnail, the screen opened up into a full screen video, and it played that step along with a narration describing what the student was supposed to do. What happened over the course of that study is the kids learned to cook independently, but they still needed the iPod with the video prompts to do it successfully. So really what we did is we transferred their dependency from a person to an electronic device that they had really learned to operate independently. So they were independent, and I view it as sort of the same thing as me using a recipe to cook something. So when I wrote the instructional objective, the condition was, when provided with an iPod set up with a sequence of video prompts. That was the condition. The behavior is, and I'll use the student's name, let's say my name, Woody, will independently prepare a smoothie. That's the behavior. So the condition gives you, it describes what kind of assistance or what extra things need to be there in order for the student to be successful once instruction has been completed. There are different things we might want to consider with the criterion. The criterion is part of an objective that tells you how well something needs to be done. Now, in the case of those 2 high school students, I was more concerned with them being independent. So my criterion was, I'll go through the whole objective. The condition was, when provided with an iPod with a sequence of video prompts, Woody will independently prepare a smoothie 100% of the steps for 2 consecutive sessions. So in other words, I specify that the student needed to be able to do it by himself 2 times on 2 different days. And then I was sure that that student had learned that skill. So my criterion was more based on accuracy, though the person actually did it correctly. Sometimes you may be working with a student who can already do the skill, but just isn't doing it quickly enough. I worked with a young lady with autism who was learning to stock shelves in a grocery store. She could do it independently, and the shelves she stocked were absolutely perfect. The cans were all lined up, but she was about to lose her job because it took her so long to line everything up perfectly. So I had to focus on rate with her. The number of cans that she could stock per minute had to be increased. Sometimes we're more interested in something called latency. That's the amount of time between some kind of cue and the person responding. So in other words, if I give a student a direction and the student begins to follow the direction, but it takes him 5 minutes to get up and move to the area I asked him to go to, that may not be acceptable. So I want to decrease the latency. And then duration may be another criterion. So it's how long a behavior lasts. If I have a student who has very low rates of on-task behavior, I may want to increase the time that that student is on task. So my objective might be something like this. When provided with a self-monitoring sheet and a visual timer, Woody will remain on task for periods of 30 minutes for 2 consecutive class periods. So that would be the condition, the behavior, and the criteria. When learners are just working on a skill, we're focused on something called acquisition. So acquisition has to do with just learning a skill. Once someone learns a skill, though, then we focus on other things like fluency, maintenance, generality, and adaptation. So we'll talk briefly about what each of those things are. So acquisition is learning the skill. When you're learning a language, you're first focused on just learning vocabulary, just learning what words mean and learning how to pronounce them. So if for instance, if I take a class, my wife's family's from Italy, so if I want to go to Italy, I may start learning some Italian. So at the beginning, I'm just going to learn some words. So I'm just going to be in acquisition. Okay, knowing what some words mean and being able to say some words does not mean that you have functional use of a language, however. So we want to expand the use of our skill so that it's functional. Those involve these other components. For instance, I may be focused more on fluency, or I may focus more on maintenance. Generalization becomes an issue as well, as does adaptation. Fluency has to do with how quickly or smoothly we perform a skill. For instance, getting back to the language example, when you speak a language fluently, it means that you do it at a normal conversational pace. So depending on the skill, fluency might be doing something more quickly with less effort. That would be an increased rate. Or it may be doing something longer. For example, with social skills, with kids with autism, it might be performing a skill for a longer period of time. Or it might be an issue of latency. It may be that when you're more fluent with the skill, the response time would be quicker between some kind of cue or signal and you actually performing the skill. When we talk about maintenance, we are concerned with how long the behavior occurs after instruction's over. So if a skill maintains, it means the student's going to continue to be able to perform that skill usefully after we're no longer teaching it. There are different ways to ensure maintenance, and we'll be covering each of those. Sometimes it involves post-checks, sometimes practicing something after it's already been learned, or sometimes using something we call response-dependent fading. We'll spend time talking about these things. Generality refers to the extent to which someone can perform a skill that's been taught in a different setting or a different situation. It's a characteristic of individuals with autism spectrum disorders to have difficulty with generalization. In other words, if a student with autism learns a skill at school, the person will not necessarily be able to perform that skill at home. So there are different things that we have to do to ensure that a skill is going to generalize. We'll spend time talking about those later in the course. Adaptation is a pretty advanced level of learning. It has to do with the person's ability to change or adapt to different demand situations or special conditions in the environment. In other words, If you're used to doing a skill one way and the situation changes so that that's no longer an effective way to perform that skill, you're able to adapt or change the way you do it to accommodate the new conditions. So, we've got an example of an objective written for each level of learning. With acquisition, our objective focuses on the person simply learning a skill and being able to do it independently. With fluency, the objective focuses on the person doing it at a certain rate or with a certain level of ease. Fluid means doing it something fluidly or with ease. With maintenance, we're concerned with how long the behavior continues after instruction. So it's going to be worded differently. The focus is different here. Generality has to do with performing the skill in a situation or an environment other than that in which it was taught. And adaptation has to do with changing the skill or changing the way it's performed to meet differing demands in the environment. So each of these focuses on a different type of learning, and it's important to be familiar with each of them so that you can write an objective that's appropriate for your students. Another way of looking at objectives is to use something called Bloom's hierarchy of learning levels. Very briefly, there are 3 levels. Knowledge is simply being able to recall or recognize something. So if you're able to, let's say, do well on a multiple choice test, it means that you're able to recognize something. Comprehension is another level of learning. It requires you to be able to understand the meaning of something. So you can rephrase something or you can apply it to something different. Application is used in concrete situations. So the level of application means that you can take something that you've learned and you can actually put it to use. Now, this has implications for this course, for example. It's possible that in other courses you learned knowledge at a level of recall. I see this a lot in undergraduate students who take the first course I teach. They're used to their general college courses when recall and recognition is all they've been required to do. However, now that they're in a program that's more focused, the requirements of the course are comprehension and application. A lot of them do really poorly on the first few tests until they understand that the expectations are different. So to be able to apply something, you have to know it really well. Consider how you would write an objective for a student if application was the goal. There are other aspects to Bloom's hierarchy that we're not going to spend a lot of time on because they're typically not a level of skill that the kids with whom we're going to work are going to be performing. For example, analysis has to do with taking information and breaking it down into parts. Synthesis has to do with taking stuff and grouping it together. So, for example, this is something you're going to be required to do in college papers, is taking a body of information and then synthesizing it into a paragraph that describes everything. And then finally, evaluation is when you can make value statements about information. You can actually evaluate it and say whether this is a good approach or a bad approach.